Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final lecture of the 2021-22 session. As I'm known to many of you, I will just say a few words about myself by way of an introduction. As well as serving as the Huguenot Society's Honorary Secretary from 2004 to 2009, and for the past 3 years as its President, I have been Chairman of the Library and Archive Committee since 2009, and involved with the Huguenot Library since 2002. My work on one of the library's holdings, the consistory minutes and poor relief accounts of the French church at Thorpe-le-Saucon, 1683 to 1763, was published by the Society in 2015 as Huguenot Society Quarto Series, Volume 62. And it was during my research for that volume that I first became interested in the archive that is the subject of this lecture. Having had the opportunity earlier this year to study these manuscripts in greater detail, it is my pleasure to present as my presidential paper, La Société de Poitou et du Loudanois, 1714 to 1812, a regional Huguenot fund in the refuge. Among the institutional archives held at the Huguenot Library are the papers of the Société de Poitou et du Loudanois, deposited at the French hospital after its dissolution in 1812. Consisting of 4 large account ledgers, 1 surviving minutes book, and several miscellaneous papers, this archive documents the foundation and work of the charitable society set up by a group of wealthy Poitevins to alleviate the distress of their poor compatriots. As observed by Charles Marmoy in 1969, very little has been written about this society, probably, he thought, due to its culture of secrecy. Unlike the northern regional societies, which were essentially friendly societies, it did not have a mutualist structure whereby all members were entitled to claim benefits. Rather, it followed the same model of charitable poor relief as other southern regional societies. On a smaller scale, it was modelled on the Royal Bounty Fund or the French Church of London, which had both provided frontline support for the 17th century flood of Huguenot refugees. Poitou, a populous province on the Atlantic coast of France, was the first to endure the onslaught of the 1681 dragonnade, and many of its estimated 80,000 Protestants fled their homeland before the second dragonnade and revocation in 1685, arriving in locations such as Thorpe-le-Saucon in North Essex as early as 1682, and continuing to settle there until 1725, thus forming the largest cohort of Huguenot refugees in that place. In Spitalfields, Poitevins were the majority group at La Patente, their adopted church, accounting for 37% of its congregation over its 97-year history. They brought with them a strong sense of regional identity, intensified by suffering, as reflected in these manuscripts, which, apart from the final few papers, are entirely written in French. The 4 ledgers contain far more than poor relief accounts. Ledger A starts with the Society's mission statement, followed by its articles or bylaws, dated 2nd of December 1714, the first year of the reign of King George. Moved to compassion by the plight of their compatriots, many of whom had fallen into necessity due to age, illness, unemployment, or a lack of opportunity to learn new trades, and following the example of other provinces who were ably assisting their own refugees, the founders resolved to work with God's grace and all their might to achieve their charitable aims. The Society of Niort, founded in 1696, finding its own objectives and compass within those set out for the wider province, joined forces with it, and as the town of Loudun and its surrounding area, a Protestant stronghold just north of Poitou, was considered to be spiritually part of the province, its refugees also elected to join the new society, thereafter to be known as La Société de Poitou et du Loup-Danois. In this paper, I will refer to it as the SPL. 22 articles then set out the SPL's constitution. Firstly, when they were to hold their 2 annual sermons and general assemblies, and the mechanism for electing officers, namely a governing body of 12, comprising at their head a treasurer who was to act as moderator, a secretary who would deal with les écritures but who could replace the treasurer if necessary, and 10 commissioners, their task being to collect the charitable contributions from donors and to distribute relief to the poor on their list from a common pot, and to account fully for both operations to the 2 main officers, the first in post being Auguste Desminières, treasurer, and François Lalargère, secretary. Article 4 dealt with the division of London and its principal dependencies into 2 parts, following a line from north to south along the Fleet Ditch, a river now largely underground, which discharges into the Thames near Blackfriars. The area east of the ditch, consisting of La Ville proprement dite, namely the City of London, Spitalfields, Wapping, etc., was designated Le Quartier Oriental, or Eastern Quarter, while that to the west of the ditch, comprising Temple Bar, Westminster, Soho, etc., Le Quartier Occidental, or Western Quarter. Commissioners were to be assigned to 5 districts within each quarter, as conveniently for them as was possible, and organised into 2 committees, which were to meet before the 2 annual assemblies, along with the secretary or treasurer, who, we learn in Article 16, could exercise a casting vote. Attendance at meetings and deadlines for submitting accounts were to be strictly regulated, with fines payable by those who lapsed without valid reason. Article 11 defined the conditions of membership, open to Poitevins and their direct descendants, and also to charitable people from outside the province, provided they were of the Reformed religion, well disposed towards the British government, and of good repute. However, as the refuge was considered a source of glory for the province, the worthy founders exhorted young Poitevins to avoid mixing with those of the English nation, but instead take pride in maintaining links of friendship and interest with people of their province, rather than hold them in contempt as some low souls had done, and thereby to perpetuate for future generations the memory of God's punishment for their sins, alongside his infinite mercy in sparing them. The conviction that the Huguenots were persecuted as a divine punishment for their sins was a shared belief, and in the 1680s, fasts were held annually in Nyon to appease God's anger. Here, that belief is conflated, as in other writings, with the notion of being a chosen people, who should keep themselves apart from the inhabitants of the host country, thus maintaining the integrity of a community which might yet be called upon to return to its homeland. The formation of the SPL, 30 years after the revocation, had, however, coincided with the Peace of Utrecht, a series of treaties from 1713 to 15, which brought to an end the War of the Spanish Succession, but which, by its lack of a freedom of conscience clause, would extinguish all hope of a glorious return to France for the Huguenots. By late 1714, many were already embracing opportunities open to them in England, and in that context, the anti-integration rhetoric of an earlier generation may seem outdated. Yet, a renewal of persecution in Poitou from 1713 to 15 was causing a new generation of refugees to flee, and the number of recent arrivals recorded in these manuscripts may have prompted a reaffirmation of regional solidarity and refugee identity. Article 12 defined who was not eligible for poor relief, namely widows and daughters of Poitevins who married non-Poitevins, the poor leading a scandalous life, those who took to begging on the streets or who were professional beggars. The first of these rules, not found in the constitution of other Huguenot charitable societies, was strictly enforced throughout the SPL's history. But if seen as a way of encouraging endogamy, such a gender-distinctive restriction was only a half measure, since Poitevin men were free to marry whom they pleased. Somewhat as an afterthought, Article 13 stated that the children of Poitevin fathers, whose widows remarried non-Poitevin, would not be excluded from assistance if they were in need. The final article stressed the need for secrecy and discretion regarding the society's transactions. Indeed, under Article 15, strangers were to withdraw after the sermon. It pleaded for good and modest conduct at the assemblies, in keeping with Christian ideals, and concluded with an admonition against false pride. Qu'as-tu, ô homme, que tu ne l'aies reçu? Et si tu l'as reçu, pourquoi t'en glorifies-tu? What do you own, O mortal, other than what you have received? And if you have received it, why do you glorify yourself on its account? The SPL's inaugural assembly took place at La Petite Savoie Church in Westminster on the 2nd of December 1714, with 344 people offering contributions. Designed to set up the relief fund, this collection was supported by all classes of Poitevin and others not of the province, listed alphabetically in the accounts book. Among the wealthier donors was Henri de Revigny, my Lord Comte de Galway, former Lord Justice of Ireland, and soon to become the first governor of the French hospital in St. Luke's parish, Finsbury. Galway continued to contribute generously until his death in 1720. Generous amounts were also given by influential Poitevin Louis Royan des Clouzons, the hospital's first treasurer, Paul Dufour of Loudun, its second treasurer and great benefactor, and Henri Lecoq de Saint-Léger, son-in-law of diamond importer and East India merchant Sir John Chardin, and closely connected to Galway. Lecoq contributed £10 for the whole year, for which quarterly collections, conducted until December 1715, raised £240. In terms of purchasing power, this represents approximately £36,900 in modern money. After 5 years of this quarterly exercise, the officers found it more manageable to collect and account for the funds on an annual basis, although some donors were hard put to give their contributions annually, and the poor were always assisted monthly. By March 1715, commissioners have been appointed for all 10 districts. The first we meet is the commissioner for the first district of the Eastern Quarter, Solomon Penny, a Poitevin refugee who would become one of the 37 original directors of the French hospital, and named therefore in the patent of George I, 24th of July 1718. Born Solomon Juliot, Sieur de la Pénissière, he had been an equerry to the Prince de Condé and a resident of Paris. It was there in 1686, during a thwarted escape attempt, that he was arrested and held at the Bastille, while his wife and daughter were sent to the convent of the Nouvelle Catholique, a conversion centre in the Rue Sainte-Anne in Paris. Solomon protested so vociferously at his detention that the governor of the Bastille begged to be relieved of his company, and he was placed under the supervision of the king's lieutenant in Poitou. Eventually escaping to England, he adopted an English-sounding name. Penny was an attorney at law living in New Broad Street, which you can see to the west of Bishopsgate Street on this image. In 1720, he married as his second wife the sister of Denis Chirac Jr., jeweller to Queen Anne. He and his successors as commissioner of the City District were never called upon to distribute relief, and we can assume that any needy Poitevins living on the fringes of the wealthy merchant hub were assisted by the deacons of the French Church of London in nearby Threadneedle Street. Such cooperation was a result of close links existing between the Huguenot charities, which often shared the same officers. The prime example of this is Philippe Fruchard, merchant of St. Bottles without Bishopsgate and a neighbour of Penny. Very active within the SPL, he was an energetic elder of the French Church of London and a founding director of both the French Hospital and the Spitalfields House of Charity, known as La Soupe. Indeed, among Fruchard's papers from his time as church elder is a blueprint for a Huguenot House of Charity. Nonetheless, money collected by Penny and his successors in the city would have served to offset high demand for relief in the adjacent district of Spitalfields, where Commissioner Daniel Gobet was stretched from the outset. And that you can see from this slide. An enormous amount was given out, £28.13 whereas his collection from donors amounted to only £2, 8 shillings and 9p. Where addresses of donors are known, districts can be identified. Paul Dufour, for example, who was listed in the 4th district, Western Quarter, resided in Poland Street, Soho. Dufour's place, which backs onto Poland Street, was originally Dufour's Court, a leasehold property development in the early 1720s, where the wealthy French hospital treasurer spent £800 on building 4 substantial brick houses. Alexandre Sassery, formerly a state attorney in Paris, whose family hailed from Loudun, and Madame de Bornisseau, or the Fouquet de Bornisseau family of Thouars, Poitou, listed as donors in the 1st district, Western Quarter, are documented as neighbours in Berwick Street, Soho. Over the century of its existence, the SPL was served by a large number of commissioners, many dying in office, with their sons brought onto the father's list as small contributors, often taking over their post. There were no women among the SPL's officers, unlike La Soupe, which in 1695 was being run by 11 women commissioners to 14 men. Although the 1714 articles has stipulated a 2-year term of office, many served far longer, as indeed Philippe Fruchard, commissioner for the 1st district, Eastern Quarter, from 1727 to 47, the year of his death. Managing the donors was not always simple. Some of the less wealthy commissioners would advance money for those on their list who had fallen into arrears, only to request a refund from the treasurer if the person ceased to contribute. Many were linked by intermarriage, trading networks, or close friendship. In 1757, Commissioner Abraham Augier, public notary of Pope's Head Alley in the city, was the executor for the will of master weaver Daniel Gobet, who served 2 terms as the commissioner for Spitalfields. The first distribution of relief in 1715 to the Poitevin poor tells a distressing story, and like the early Royal Bounty Fund manuscripts, the ledger is rich in detail. Among others, we glimpse Guillaume Fournier of Saint-Maxent, elderly and without work, Pierre Désiré of Villedieu, ill with smallpox, the wife of Etienne Mamour of Niort, abandoned by her husband with 3 children, widow Chapeau of Loudun, 82 years old, bedridden, David Conche of Châtellerault, suffering from consumption, from which he died, Philippe Mallet of Montcouton, without work, and his wife, afflicted both in her body and in her mind. The list goes on endlessly, and the commissioners take what measures they can. Living in overcrowded, ill-ventilated housing, many people suffered from tuberculosis, and restorative action was attempted, since several consumptives were sent to the coast for a change of air. Falling into depression, often due to the trauma of persecution and displacement, expressed as tomber en longueur, was also common, preventing people from working. Needs were diverse. Some refugees requested funds to replace worn-out clothing and restore dignity. Others needed tools or raw materials such as copper to carry on their trade. A hat maker of Lusignan was given money to help retrieve his furniture, seized to cover the cost of his rent. Grants were also awarded to help get several men out of prison, possibly the nearby Fleet debtors' prison. Yet others were given travel grants to help them relocate to Ireland, Flanders, Jersey, the Netherlands, and America, or elsewhere in England. And this was also royal bounty practice, since a refugee relocated was one less to assist over a long period in the capital. Some would-be travellers were among the large number of recent arrivals from Poitou. One such was Louis Boissineau from La Motte-Saint-Éloi, who on arrival in 1715 obtained a grant from the SPL to go to Thorpe. Letters were being exchanged between Huguenots in Poitou and family members settled within the Thorpe French community, where from 1687 to 1715, pastors Henri Mestayer and Gabriel Collin, a relative of Penny, were from Poitou. Conversely, former Poitevin recipients of royal bounty grants within this rural community appear on the SPL Commissioners' list for the period 1715 to 1750. The prospect of support from the charity's Poor Fund, coupled with bounty relief, was doubtless an incentive for those unsuccessful in farming and its ancillary trades to relocate to London. A demographic constant was the large number of widows on the poor lists, generally assisted on the same footing as their late husbands. Similarly, widows of donors, where they could afford it, continued their late husband's contribution. The Royal Bounty Fund divided the refugees into persons of the best quality, the middling sort, and the common poor, divisions which are totally absent from the SPL's distributions. However, titles such as Le Sieur, La Dame, or as here, Mademoiselle for a widow, of some social standing in her own right, indicate sufficiently the class to which a recipient belonged, with impersonal terms such as La Tristan, or La Mangonneau, or indeed La Bonne Femme, placing other women in a lower social order. Differential amounts awarded also reflect degrees of status for both men and women. And here in line 3, we see Mademoiselle Bobin et sa fille, who were paid £1 6 shillings and 8 for 8 months. And she was, in fact, by her maiden name, Jeanne Olivier, the daughter of Daniel Olivier, the first ancien at Thorpe-le-Saucon in 1683. She had married a jeweller, relocated to London, and married a jeweller called Gédéon Bobin from Thouars. Exceptionally, the SPL's charitable arm extended outside London by order of the two committees. In 1721, Suzanne Benoit's family was given 2 grants for her medical and burial expenses at Colchester. And in 1736 and 1751, outgift aid was allocated to Messrs. Caillou and Fougère in Canterbury. In these cases, personal contacts rather than policy may have played a role. The Benoit's family were in fact poor relations of merchant Pierre Deschamps. Funds were also available to individual Poitevins at Wandsworth, then considered to be part of Surrey. Additionally, in 1716, Monsieur Desminières, treasurer, made a block grant to Monsieur Saint-Paul Bouquet, minister at Wandsworth, for the poor Poitevins there. And in 1740, a group at Wandsworth was briefly annexed to the list of the 4th District, Eastern Quarter. In the context of support for the elderly or infirm, early links were forged with the French hospital. This was initiated in 1721, with a bequest of £200 from the will of former treasurer Louis Desclouseaux to set up a fund for a Poitevin or Breton inmate recommended by the SPL. In addition to the 11 beneficiaries listed here, Marie Godard was elected to take up the vacant place in 1727. Small maintenance grants recorded in the accounts also identify several other Poitevins who were part funded by the SPL during their time at La Providence, although these payments do not all appear in Charles Marmoy's entries in Quarter Series 52 and 53. These grants went to French hospital inmates Pierre Baudet, Pierre Delino, Thomas Georget, Louis Guillot, Samuel Jamonneau, Balthazar Métaux, Esther Quinefaux, François Rouleau, Marguerite Turpot, Moïse Vigne, and Philippe Villers. Among the directors of the French hospital were a number of SPL officers at different periods, the most notable being Solomon Penny and his kinsman André Julliot, Mercer of St. Giles in the Fields, a commissioner of the 1st District Western Quarter, and father-in-law of the celebrated goldsmith Paul de Lamerie. Also Philippe Fruchard and his nephew Jacques Fruchard, the Deschamps merchant family of Bucklersbury City, members of the Augier family of master weavers, and Leonard Turquin and Pierre Merzeau, the SPL's last secretary and treasurer. Alongside such support, there was a focus on education and training, with widows among those receiving generous grants to maintain their children in school. A specific apprenticeship fund was set up, the 1714 preamble noting that lack of training opportunities had resulted in poverty. In total, 45 children, including 8 girls, were apprenticed between 1716 and 1753, with several masters recorded by name. In March 1736, Philippe Fruchard paid 10 guineas to apprentice Jean Join to an English engraver, John Carwitham, living in Newport Street near Long Acre. The cost of initial clothing for an apprentice was sometimes funded by the SPL, an advantage for a master. In 1733, Jean Turmot's son was bound free of premium, on condition he was properly fitted out. Some children were awarded lower amounts, several as part payment towards their premium, others possibly to train as non-indentured textile workers. The SPL's first foray into investment funds to provide an endowment for their charitable activities took place in 1715, with the purchase of 7 1710 lottery tickets, yielding an annual income of £4.18 for 28 remaining years. The investment was funded by a £60 bequest in the will of Thomas Bureau from Niort, whose family of renowned printers and booksellers had suffered extreme duress during the 1685 dragonnade, and who, in the refuge, had become a trustee of the French Church of St. Martin Augurs. To this was added in 1719 a benefit ticket issued in 1710, producing £5 annual interest over 24 years, part of a request from member Anne Deslandes, the combined tickets creating the apprenticeship fund, in keeping with the testator's wishes. The end of Queen Anne's reign saw a proliferation of national lotteries to fund her continental wars, with people eager to purchase and give as presents benefit tickets, which not only provided a guaranteed return, but the bonus of double interest if a ticket was drawn. Paul Dufour, among other Huguenots, had considerable success in the 1712 lottery. And here we see Southsea House at the end of Threadneedle Street. This financial buttress, restricted to serving the apprenticeship fund in the first instance, was bolstered by subsequent bequests and converted in 1719 to holdings of Southsea stock and lottery annuities. Universal dividends from the administrators of the Southsea Company in 1721 and 1722 enabled the SPL to weather the effect of the notorious 1720 Southsea bubble. Trustees from among those officers with financial acumen examined and signed the annual accounts. Merchants Philippe Fruchard and Pierre Deschamps, close friends and associates, obliged in the early days, and thereafter Pierre Deschamps Jr., Daniel Gobet, Solomon Penny, Jacques Fruchard, and Philippe Liège, among others. In 1727, the capital, amounting to £266, 4 shillings and 8pence, was invested in a mix of South Sea stock and South Sea annuities, and in 1736, these were converted to 3% Bank of England Exchequer bonds. Note the signature of Solomon Penny at the bottom of this manuscript, Sol Penny, which may well have been a play on words, because in fact, Sol is the French word for penny, his adopted name in Great Britain. Since quite early on, the amounts collected fell short of those distributed in the poorer districts, and when the annual accounts did not balance due to a high demand for relief, the treasurer was obliged to put up the money himself until such times as some equity was sold, often at a loss, to reimburse him. In this context, it is worth noting that in 1727, the French Church of St. Martin Orgar near Cannon Street would vote to suspend relief to poor members of its community living east of the Fleet Ditch for fear of its resources being overwhelmed. The situation was exacerbated by the difficulty in planning the outlay, since a number of extraordinaire, that is, contingency payments, were added to the monthly pensions on each commissioner's list. Again, this practice emulated that of the Royal Bounty Fund. In addition to the ubiquitous Philippe Fruchard, several SPL commissioners, Daniel Gobet, Jean de Lafont, Pierre Deschamps Sr. and Jr., Jacques Fruchard, as well as Minister Paul Ladouespe, appear in the Royal Bounty warrants as commissioners between 1714 and 1753. Such insider knowledge allowed the charity to occasionally save money by suspending poor relief for 2 months when a bounty grant became imminent, as in summer 1726, or to assist people who had been overlooked, such as one Jacquet in the 1725 distribution. Initially, the SPL's biannual sermons and assemblies alternated between St. Martin Orgars in the city and La Petite Savoie in Spring Gardens, Westminster, both Huguenot churches which conform to the Anglican ritual translated into French. Lists of expenses indicate that St. Martin Orgars provided an organist. Other expenses included a portier to give access to the church and its closed pews, a lecteur to read the lessons, and more rarely a chantre to lead the singing, or a souffleur to extinguish the candles. The minister was conveyed to church by coach or sedan chair, and a pint of wine and occasionally biscuits were procured for communion purposes. In accordance with the bylaws, the society's books were taken to each assembly by one of the poor, paid a small sum to do so. Receipts from the collection boxes, les bouettes, Poitevin dialect for boîte, provided an important supplementary income. Additional donations of relief grants were also handled by the treasurer at the assemblies, and a guinea routinely given to 1 or 2 members of the deserving poor. By 1723, the Spring Sermon and Assembly had moved to Nonconformist La Patente de Spitalfields in Crispin Street, the Poitevins' favoured church near Spitalfields Market, and from 1741, the sermon took place at its new temple in Brown's Lane, now Hanbury Street. The autumn sermon being held at Conformist l'Église des Grecs in Hog Lane. And here we see on the right a slide of l'Église des Grecs, the famous painting Noon, which is well known to everyone, William Hogarth. And on the left, on the Jean Roch's map, in the right-hand corner, you can see Hog Lane, which is now, of course, Charing Cross Road. At both places, expenses were lower than St. Martin Augurs, and alternating between the two persuasions would have accommodated the different constituencies within the SPL, conformist and non-conformist. By 1741, the two annual assemblies were taking place after each church sermon at a local tavern, such as the White Hart in Bishopsgate or the Three Tuns in Church Street, Spitalfields, and in Soho at the Turk's Head on the corner of Greek Street and Compton Street, where numerous committee meetings were also held, at the Rummer and the King's Head in Gerrard Street, the White Swan in Grafton Street, the Standard in Leicester Fields, the King's Arms in Marylebone Street, and the Cadogan, probably in Chelsea, where the Cadogan estate was built from 1717. Various coffee houses and members' homes in Cecil Court, Marylebone, Swallow Street, Bishopsgate, and St. Martin's Lane also provided venues for committee meetings. Frequent mentions in the accounts of un reste d'écho, money left over from a collection for a meal, indicate that members of the governing body were dining at the taverns after the assemblies, and this is confirmed by entries in the surviving minutes book. In November 1737, a folio of lengthy minutes and calculations recorded the conclusion reached at a special general meeting held at the Crown Cavern on Ludgate Hill, namely, that since most of the projected interest of £257 4 from the Bureau and des Landes bequests had already been expended on apprenticeships, with the remainder being held in reserve, wishes of the testators had been amply fulfilled, thus enabling the company to free up the capital for other charitable uses. Among the 33 names appended to this agreement was that of former SPL Commissioner and French Hospital Director Jacques Binet, who in 1735 had been entrusted with the charity's money to invest at the higher rate of 4%, the return recorded by Philippe Fouchard for several French Church of London investments in the late 1720s. This arrangement with a friend and benefactor was honoured, and Binet duly returned the £300 capital plus interest. But 19 years later, with its investments doubled due to new bequests, including in 1747 an equity transfer of £200 under the terms of the will of Françoise Dufault, the charity would not be as fortunate. Madame Dufault had nominated the SPL as her residuary legatee, and the sale of her remaining effects, amounting to £76.15, combined with the equity, represented the most generous bequest in the charity's history. The suggested use of the legacy, the possible opening up of relief and apprenticeships to non-Potiphar children, seems, however, to have fallen outside its remit. Moreover, the apprenticeship fund had been wound up, and although a few more children were indentured up to 1753, the Society had urgent poor relief issues to address. In 1745, at a meeting of the Eastern and Western Committees at the Turk's Head in Soho, it had been decided to decrease relief to 10 months, and later in 1759 to 9, with the summer months, June to August, considered the least critical to suppress payment to the poor. Poor relief remained at this level until 1766, when the charity voted to make payments all year round due to the high price of foods, a cost of living crisis which persisted, in fact, until 1769. In 1742, Le Sieur Claude Benet had taken over as treasurer from Paul Giraudoux, who had served the SPL well for 17 years. And the same year, Benet became a Royal Bounty Commissioner. Claude's father, James Benet, a benefactor and former signatory of the accounts, was a wealthy merchant trading in wines and brandies with Lisbon, and in 1743 his son inherited a substantial amount under the terms of his will, of which he was co-executor with Pierre Deschamps Sr. However, excessive expenditure over income increased alarmingly, with the Society owing Bonnet an advance of £146, 17 shillings and sevenpence in 1753. On the 31st of July, 1754, a special General Assembly was urgently called at Sam's Coffee House in Ludgate Street to advise the company commissioners of the unthinkable. The Treasurer had sold the SPL's consolidated capital investments of £600 without authorization and had appropriated the proceeds, but was now bankrupt. The following year, the same body gathered at Mr. Rigaud's house in St. Martin's Lane, where by 12 votes to 4, they reduced the sermons and assemblies to one a year as a financial imperative. Although the administrators of Bonnet's insolvency reimbursed a percentage in the pound on 3 occasions, the final debt was still almost £200, a sum the SPL could ill afford to lose, and which saw it spend 9 years attempting to track down Bonnet's widow after his death in 1773, a vain and puzzling exercise, since his will clearly states that his wife had predeceased him. What estate Bonnet did own was left to a friend, Elizabeth Wilcox, who, he wrote, had alone supported him when he was abandoned by those he had trusted. The SPL could have been forgiven for giving up after this setback, but by 1781 further bequests had enabled it to gradually increase its capital to £500 in consolidated bank annuities. However, equity holdings were now in the names of several trustees, and Bonnet's successor as treasurer, the frugal Jacques Fouchard, proved a safe pair of hands. A number of faithful ministers preached the sermons and are listed at the front of the minutes book. Several, M. de la Chaumette, Élie Brilly, and Jacques Bourdillon, officiated at La Patente and became involved in the running of the SPL during its latter years. Bourdillon, married to Henriette Fouquet de Bornizeau of Thouars, whose father had died at Thorpe in 1708, is known for his 50th Jubilee sermon, given in 1782 at the Artillery Church in Spitalfields, a rallying call to Huguenot descendants now steadily drifting towards Anglican churches such as Christ Church or local nonconformist chapels. In 1781, Bourdillon had pleaded in favour of Jeanne Risby, daughter of Poitevin Jacques Rollet of Thorpe, who relocated to Spitalfields with her parents and English husband in 1763. And the SPL officers, while invoking the early bylaw, gave a total of 20 shillings and 6 sols from their own pockets. Yet in 1786, when it emerged that a certain Escoin had married an Englishman, she was unceremoniously removed from the poor relief list. Where official relief was concerned, exogamy was still being sanctioned. With La Patente at Brown's Lane and the Artillery Church both absorbed by the Mother Church in 1786, the SPL held one sermon at Threadneedle Street in 1788, preached by de la Chaumette, and thereafter assembled at its chapel of ease, l'Église Neuve of Brick Lane, with alternate years still at Les Grecs in Soho. And here we see a slide of l'Église Neuve, which some of you will know now as the Brick Lane Mosque. From the 1780s, the assemblies increasingly focused on fundraising, and handbills were distributed in an effort to increase attendance at the anniversary sermon. The secretary, Leonard Turcan, with the support of a minister, reiterated insistently a 1780 ruling inserted into the bylaws, requiring the local poor to report to the consistory office of the church where the sermon was being held in order to collect that month's relief. At the same time, he was issuing stern directives to attend committee meetings and to go from door to door to collect contributions, measures ignored by many of the commissioners, some now living in the country. Commissioner Mr. Clement, who in 1790 offered to have 1,000 handbills printed and who was calling on his donors, was cited as an example to follow. But with a dwindling number of donors and fewer Poitevins to assist, the SPL was, to a large extent, becoming a convivial dining club, typical of the age. Apart from confirming the date and preacher for the next sermon and reviewing a few poor relief grants, business at non-quorate committee meetings had become limited to deciding at which tavern to dine and how many places to reserve. From 1790, the King's Head in poultry proved popular after the sermon at l'Église Neuve, and alongside the appreciation of the 16 diners listed that year, the amount paid per head and the waiters' tips were also recorded. And here we can see a slide of the city showing poultry at the top where the inn was located, and just below that, Bacchusbury, which I will mention in a moment. In April 1793, 16 dined at George's Coffee House in Coventry Street, opposite the Haymarket, a convenient venue after the sermon at Les Grecs. In 1794, back at the Poultry Tavern, 6 officers' widows were among the 13 diners. The wills of one wealthy family within the SPL are revealing. Buried at St. Stephen Walbrook near their warehouse and counting house in Bucklersbury. In their lifetime, the Deschamps sons will certainly have been able to bail the SPL out. Their father, Pierre Deschamps, a distiller with an interest in finance and diamonds, had left them a considerable fortune. Yet, by 1770, their focus was turning to other charitable giving, with a much smaller bequest left to the society that year by serving Secretary Pierre Deschamps Jr., and even less in 1773 by his brother Jean, than the £100 bequeathed by their father in 1757. Had they concluded that the French Church of London and La Providence, alongside the Royal Bounty, offered sufficient support for the decreasing number of Poitevin poor? Pierre Deschamps Jr. left £100 to the French Church poor, and as French hospital directors, both brothers supported that institution. But they were equally generous to English charities, particularly the London Hospital in Whitechapel, where Pierre Deschamps Sr. had been a governor. First established in 1740 at Goodman's Fields as the London Infirmary to provide medical care for manufacturers, seamen in the merchant service and their families, this charity would have been directly relevant to the family's mercantile vocation. Local charity schools and St. Stephen Walbrook Parish were also beneficiaries under the sons' wills. While supportive of those Huguenot institutions well placed to make an impact, their commitment to English charities was a clear sign of integration. By 1812, with its funds exhausted and very few pensioners, it was time for the SPL to close its books, the final account listing just 5 donors and 9 poor, 5 of whom were being relieved by the French Church of London vestry, the last £50 of equity having been handed over. Leonard Turquin's Rye statement records the final balance to carry over, 14 shillings and 5 pence. Yet much had been achieved over the 98 years of the SPL's existence in terms of support and fellowship among members, some of whom, we learn intriguingly from Philip Frouchard's will, were meeting weekly in the 1740s as the Poitevins Club at the Laurel Tree, a pub in Brick Lane. And thanks to the painstaking work of the SPL secretaries, a facet of refugee life in Georgian London has been richly documented, a resource for academic and genealogical research alike. And I leave you with this final image, a table showing the principal officers of the SPL from 1714 to 1812. And thank you for your attention.